Hey everyone, in this video I sit down with Professor Oliver Harris to talk about the work he did on the new movie Queer. Professor Harris is an expert on the book the film is based on, as well as the author William S. Burroughs. As such, he was brought in as a consultant for the film, and in this capacity he had several meetings with director Luca Guadagnino, screenwriter Justin Kuritzkes, as well as the film's lead actor Daniel Craig. In our interview, I got to ask him about William Burroughs' life at the time in which he wrote the novella. We also talk about the process the filmmaking team took in navigating the story, as well as the times in which Professor Harris met Burroughs. I think what our conversation reveals is the essential ingredients in adaptation. To me, Queer is one of those novels, like Dune, that really feel challenging to adapt for the big screen. I think part of what makes it difficult material is that its use of language over narrative is a big part of what makes it evocative. It's incredibly surrealist and weighted by the context of its author's biography. Understanding this and finding a way to embrace this is exactly what Professor Harris and Luca Guadagnino discussed. This interview is a fascinating insight into that process, as well as one that left me feeling enriched about the film. If you haven't seen Queer, we don't really go into heavy spoilers. There is a section where we talk about how the book is unfinished, but the film isn't, though we don't drastically go into too much detail there. There are time codes in the description to help guide you. I conducted this interview, in part for research I'm doing for an upcoming video on the film Queer, so do make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on that. Otherwise, sit back, relax, and enjoy the interview. Just to begin with, for people who don't know anything, haven't got a clue, who is William S. Burroughs, and what would you describe is significant about his work, and what is the Beat Generation?
Okay, I think the place to begin actually is with the fact that Burroughs is actually quite well known in a superficial way across a lot of areas of culture, whereas most writers, you tend to need to be interested in the literature to begin with. Whereas with Burroughs, his name crops up so much in popular culture from the singers in particular that he influenced, whether it's people like Iggy Pop, who took the lyrics of Lust for Life from one of Burroughs's books, or Frank Zappa, Laurie Anderson, Joy Division. There's so many bands who have been influenced by Burroughs. So he has a presence that is unusual for a writer. He also has a pretty notorious biography, which has got some interesting kind of sensational highlights. So from really quite early on, he had a high visibility. And again, that's unusual from a writer outside of their usual literary circles. What that has tended to mean is that people know a little bit about him. And if you put it in a kind of tabloid newspaper or a kind of blog kind of headline, it sounds pretty crazy. Behind that, there's a really serious experimental visionary writer. And in my view, just one of the most interesting writers because he challenged so many ideas and assumptions about not just writing, but about the world. So he's a very political writer as well. Come back to the question about the Beat Generation. That's a little bit easier because that's, again, a group largely of American writers who came of age in the 1950s, so kind of post-war America. And they stood out, again, because they had an interesting profile, the main writers being Burroughs and also the poet Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. And again, unlike most writers, they became very well known just generally amongst through magazines and TV coverage. So again, they reach parts that most writers don't reach.
Yeah.
So you can have some great writers, but very few people ever read them. And what was great about the Beat Generation was that they wrote in ways and they wrote about things that grabbed people's attention, whether it was kind of very anti-capitalist, very critical of America, very interested in issues of race and sexuality. And although they had some big blind spots in retrospect, because most people do, they nevertheless set a very progressive agenda at a time when this was very unusual for writers who had a public profile. So that's one reason why a lot of people have heard of them. And my own backstory is I came to William Burroughs through having older sisters who were the girlfriends of people in bands in the Manchester band scene. And they all had a couple of things in common. They all played music, they all did drugs, and they all read William Burroughs. well, I'm not much of a musician, and my taste in drugs is quite modest. So I got very interested in William Burroughs. So I got interested in him because he sounded cool, and that's quite a superficial way of getting into anything. But actually, it becomes a kind of door, and then you pass through that door, and sometimes there's not a lot more there. In the case of Burroughs, I spent 40 years finding out there's quite a lot there. So I found him a very rich vein of somebody with just really interesting ideas and interesting creative methods and very challenging. He's not somebody you tend to read just for pleasure. He tends to be more challenging than that. So that's a kind of, in the round, how I would present Burroughs. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, no, that's a pretty good summary. I've read sections of Queer, but when I saw the movie at the London Film Festival, I knew like nothing about anything to do with this side of literature, or I knew nothing about what the film was going to be, and I was quite sort of overwhelmed by the experience of it. But it's kind of given me something to chew on since I've seen it, and definitely like left me on a bit of a detective quest, going back on like where did this story come from. Having read passages from the book, it doesn't strike me as an easy adaptation. The language is so surreal. How did you think about when Luca approached you? Like, how did you think about doing an adaptation to Queer?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I would say I was slightly anxious because I'd been very disappointed with the adaptation of Naked Lunch that David Cronenberg did. And I say that because I've always been an admirer of Cronenberg's films. You know, they're really wacky and far out. And I thought, well, he's perfect for Burroughs, who is quite wacky and far out. And I remember when I watched Naked Lunch, I just found it very boring and very brown and slow. And Burroughs is fast and furious. And although his humor is difficult, you know, it will alienate some people. If you find him funny, he's really funny. And the kind of funny where actually you often feel quite embarrassed about laughing because he can make something funny which isn't funny, especially when he deals with issues of race, sexuality, class, all the usual things which we tend to be very careful about. Burroughs tends to sort of push those envelopes, and I think he does so because, well, for complicated reasons, shall we say. But so in the case of that adaptation, I'm disappointed. I didn't find Cronenberg funny at all. Queer is a strange text because from one point of view, it's hilariously funny. From another point of view, it's excruciatingly unfunny. So how would you decide how to interpret that? Difficult. It's also quite a short text where not a lot happens. It's a text that Burroughs wrote quite early in his career. And it would be easy to see it as being a very personal text because it's the only thing he ever wrote which describes a human relationship.
Yeah.
Which already tells you something about the kind of writer Burroughs isn't. Because obviously for most writers, well, you know, human relationships would seem to be pretty central to any kind of novel. Burroughs hasn't done that. So it's very unusual that it's about his relationship with a young man that he fell in love with. And it's a story of his desperation, where that desperation takes you. My own feeling is that if you've lived through any kind of asymmetry in a relationship, someone who's been crazy about you and you didn't reciprocate, or the other way around, then you'll understand it no matter what your own sexuality is. And I think it's quite important because I'm a straight guy, but I've always found Burroughs quite easy to relate to, even though he was a gay man. So I think the way into it is to understand what does it mean to desire somebody? You know, where does that come from? Why is that person and not this person? Because usually when you're crazy about someone, other people think, well, you know, they're quite nice, or yeah, they don't share your passion. So where does that come from? And where will it take you? You know, what are you prepared to do? And I think what I found very challenging about Queer is it shows somebody describing a very excruciating relationship, really. And you know, having the courage to confront that, but also I think from that, trying to understand things about himself. You know, how do I control my own desire? You know, where does it come from? And where, and like I say, you know, where does it take you? So from that point of view, it's very difficult text to see how you would interpret it. And Luca Guadagnino was really, I think he turned to me because I'd edited the book and had, spent, 25, 30 years sort of writing and researching it in many ways. So it meant a lot to me that he took it that seriously. He wanted to hear my point of view. It was quite risky, of course, because my point of view might have not been his point of view at all. And then what's he going to do? So I'm quite glad it's worked out quite well. I think the other thing also is Daniel Craig, who was not an obvious choice to cast.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people, I knew him mainly from the Bond films, and between you and me and the rest of the audience, not a big fan of the Bond films. So it's just not my style. So I thought, well, Daniel Craig, can he do it? And then as I began to think about it, I realized actually he can really act. It's just that most famous films of him are not of him acting. There's no acting in James Bond. If you look at earlier films like Love's the Devil, if you look at even Layer Cake, and especially Sylvia, where he plays Ted Hughes, if you look at other films of his, actually he's a very fine actor. But it still surprised me because when I saw him play the Benoit Blanc detective films, which are more recent, they're very funny. He can ham it up.
Mm-hmm.
So I began to realize that actually he really could be a very good choice for a kind of Burroughs-y character. It's not William Burroughs. It's a projection of Burroughs. It's not meant to be Burroughs. So it's not a biopic.
Yeah.
It's quite an important distinction, I think. You don't want to get confused thinking this is what William Burroughs was like. He wasn't like that. This is one side of him, which he projected out. And if I put it this way, most of us these days do our best to airbrush ourselves.
Yeah.
We like to look our best, and this, if you imagine, is actually looking your absolute worst. What's the worst part of you? And Burroughs was interested in confronting that and projecting it. So it's not an attractive picture in many ways, and I think it's a great credit to Daniel Craig that he's performed it in a way that is, I think, makes you feel very sympathetic towards him.
Yeah.
Even in some ways, he's not an attractive character. I still think he elicits a lot of sympathy. It humanizes the identity he has, makes it funny as well as being very desperate. And then the film takes it in, as you know, in increasingly strange directions, which, if you don't know your Burroughs, you might think, what is going on here? If you know your Burroughs, actually, you're more prepared for it, because a lot of Burroughs texts are very weird. So that was my original take on the film. It's a big challenge how they're going to do it. Guadagnino had done, I think, some good prep for it. Call Me by Your Name, which I guess you're familiar with.
Very much.
It's a beautiful film, and quite romantic in the way that again Burroughs isn't. But I could see he could. The way I look at it is, Guadagnino has not tried to do an imitation of Burroughs. We might think that what we want is something that is as close to the original as possible, but actually that's not what we want. What we really are looking for in a homage is to bring something new to the original and to bring something out of the original that is there, but maybe you just don't notice it. So Guadagnino is very good at things that are beautiful. And that's not usually what we associate with Burroughs, actually. He can be very funny, but he's usually very fierce, very confrontational, quite ugly sometimes. So to bring out the beauty, I think, was great. But Guadagnino had also made things like Suspiria, which is a very weird remake of a very weird original kind of horror film. And that told me that he could handle something, deeply odd, as well as something that is actually a very beautiful story or a kind of romance. So you put these things together, and I could see he had the ability, the track record to do something really suitable, which would have the Guadagnino stamp to it, but would also be true to Burroughs in ways that I think are valid. So, and what I'm getting at is going back to Cronenberg. Cronenberg is a more Burroughsian director, but I don't think he did a good Burroughsian film. Guadagnino, on some levels, is a less Burroughsian director, but I think actually, in my view, has done a much better film. So, But this is my own take, and just because I spent 40 years doing this does not mean my take is going to convince everybody else. Why would it?
I also wanted to sort of ask you about like the publication history of the book is that, it was originally rejected when Burroughs tried to publish Queer, and then 20 years later, the manuscript did get passed through. So it's sort of a story out of time. I understand that the manuscript was unfinished when it was published. So in that, and like looking through the book, they don't actually find the yage. They don't actually find it, and then it just sort of time jumps to an epilogue. But in the film, of course, they do find it, and so my question is like, what were the conversations like about filling the gap and in that sense of the story, and how did you navigate that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Um, they never actually asked me how would you finish it, which is just as well 'cause I'm not a screenwriter,
Yeah.
But when I saw an early draft of the screenplay, when I spoke to them, I realized that they were doing exactly the right thing, which was to be respectful of the original, but to do something new with it. And that's what I say, it's what you really want. You don't want them to just do what Burroughs did. And that's especially appropriate for Burroughs because his own work tended to need a collaborator to finish it at all. Um, though I would question whether any of Burroughs' books really have what we would call finish. Partly because it doesn't tend to have a plot with a narrative. If you've got a plot with a narrative, you've got to have some kind of ending. I mean, you can't leave it. But Burroughs has never been very good at that. His early works were basically followed the chronology of his own life experience. And although they're not memoirs, he did draw on what he did. And therefore, it had a kind of continuity, but there was no obvious ending because your life carries on. It doesn't end at a certain point. So, although he left Queer unfinished in 1952, it was actually worse than that because he had to cut about a fifth of it to stick into his first book, Junkie, which was not quite long enough for his publishers. So he'd barely finished writing what he'd done when he had to cut the first couple of chapters. And then he kind of abandoned it because things just in his life were a mess. I mean, as you know, biographically, he was in Mexico at the time. He had left the United States because as a gay drug user, it was not a good place to be. Which I think is also an important understanding because Burroughs' background, he came from a very haute bourgeois background, a real WASP, well-to-do, well-connected. And so in many ways, he came from the most privileged background. So from that point of view, he was simultaneously at the top of the food chain. He went to Harvard. He was expected to walk into a good job in business or the government. But at the same time as being at the top of the food chain in America, he was also at the bottom as a gay drug user. So he experienced kind of power and privilege in really odd, contradictory ways, simultaneously an insider and an outsider. And that perspective is unusual. And I think it gave him particular insight. So when he's in Mexico, all of a sudden he's back at the top of the food chain because being a white American abroad, all of a sudden he can lord it over the Mexicans who have to respect North Americans. But as a gay man, it was less trouble being gay and American in Mexico than it was at home in the US. So a lot of contradictory kind of relations of power in his life. And then, as most people know, he had this tragic event where he killed his own wife.
Yeah.
In a shooting accident. He was drunk. She was drunk. They were both quite desperate, driven people. So now he's on bail and having to report to prison every week. So it's a pretty heavy situation. Add on top of that his infatuation with a young man who was bi-curious but not gay, and you have the recipe to be really messed up. He's trying to make it as a writer at the same time. So it's a really complicated situation. He writes this first novel, Junkie, which is less problematic, but still challenging. He's writing about being a drug user at a time when most Americans do not want to hear what it's like to be a drug user. They're quite happy to hear about drug users, but not from drug users. So queer is a is doubling down in some way. Again, do they want to hear from a gay man? There's a tradition of gay writing, which you may be familiar with in kind of America, which tends to be tragic, asking for kind of sympathy and tolerance of what it's like to be a gay man at this era. Burroughs doesn't really do that. He's not really interested in whether you tolerate him or respect him or not. He's much more confrontational. So he doesn't give that easy way of being sympathetic. And in fact, he goes out of his way to be unsympathetic. So again, he's kind of queering what it means to be queer in that era. And queer, by the way, in 1952 does not mean pride. Yeah, it's an adjective used only to stigmatize people. So again, he's going against the grain and doing this. But the novel doesn't really work out. His relationship with his boyfriend is difficult. And so he abandons it. And then he, a bit later, begins this next work called In Search of Yage, which is based on this drug yage or ayahuasca. I've always confused people by pronouncing the word two different ways. The drug was called yage, but he only ever typed it as if it meant yage or sounded like yage, which I've kind of preserved the confusion there. So that was another kind of story where he was looking for this drug. It's worth bearing in mind that at that time, almost nobody knew about this drug. He actually made some quite important botanical discoveries of his own in terms of discovering the drug that makes it active. He found the ingredient which makes DMT actually work, which was just not known at that time. So he was quite a pioneer, trekking through the forest with his machete and his pith helmet and being a good amateur, botanist. So it's all a very strange period of his life. This is not some writer sitting at home in the comfort of deciding what novel he should write next for his career. Okay, it's a long way removed from that. And then, when he finishes these books, he moves off to Tangier in Morocco, and then he goes to Paris and London. So he's away for like decades from the US, and with a heroin habit to support. So, these are weird times for any writer to go through. And then in the 1980s, as he's become more respectable, better known, settled down more, living in Kansas, near where he grew up in Missouri, in St. Louis, then what happens is that there's a publishing contract for the first time. It's going to make him money, because before that he'd never made much money. Never really interested in money, actually. I mean, but when I went out to meet him in 1984, he lived in really modest circumstances. A very basic little house, and had books in a few rooms, but no mod cons, no comforts. He gave you a cup of tea in a broken mug, and it was very basic. And I really respected that, thinking, wow, if he'd wanted to have money, he probably could have done, but material possessions just did not mean anything to him. So why would he bother, even if he could? Anyway, he had a publishing contract which gave him for the first time some money, and he was already 70 years old. And in America especially, you get to that age, you need some money because healthcare is expensive. And the key part of this package for making some money was publishing Queer, which for like 30 years had been talked about, but there'd been no manuscript on hand, and he didn't want to publish it. So when they came to publishing it and they found the manuscript, they realized it's really short. It was like 25,000 words, and he cut the first quarter of it anyway to put into Junkie. So what are they going to do? So they had to find some unused material from the same area, which was from this made the epilogue, and they stuck that on. And this was James Grauholtz with really intuitive insight, because it fits brilliantly, but it came from a separate manuscript. And then they got Burroughs to write a long introduction. So this was a way of bulking out a manuscript to make it worth the publishing. So this was 30 years later, and as you say, quite different context. This was actually in the beginning of the AIDS crisis in America. So a very different time from when Burroughs was doing what we would now call sex tourism. Back in the 50s, this was, I think, more understandable in the sense that he couldn't be a gay man in America openly anyway. So that context helps understand, I think, his behavior, which in retrospect, we would view more dimly than he himself viewed his behavior, because there's a lot of self-loathing at this time. I think he's quite uncomfortable with his own sexuality, and with his identity generally. I mean, he didn't like who he was, and it's difficult if you don't like who you are, especially when you can trace it to your background so clearly. You think, well, you are a product of your background in many ways. We all are, but I think when your background has made you someone like William Burroughs, it's especially difficult. So there's a lot of challenges going on here. And yeah, I remember when Queer was published, because I'd actually gone out to meet him, just beforehand. And I was just shocked because I'd known his work as being very experimental, very funny, very political. I'd never seen a romantic side to him. And it was a real shock to realize actually this was where a lot of it came from, being somebody who had exposed himself on an emotional level. That was not what I expected at all. So it took a lot of people by surprise. That's a long answer. Not sure what the question was now. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. I mean, like you touched on like four different questions I had, so I was kind of like, oh, I don't know what to ask now. But coming back to this idea of the psychedelics and things, why do you think Burroughs was obsessed with these aspects and like the psycho magic telepathy?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, the story goes that he'd always been interested in magic ever since a child when he'd had some kind of visions. I think also he was brought up in a very repressive era where it was very clear what was expected of him. As I say, he came from a very distinctive class background where he was expected to succeed materially and in class terms. And he just hated that. He just thought it was incredibly boring. He probably looked at his parents and thought, I don't want that. So to some degree, he had to burn his bridges. And I think he's an object lesson in how hard it is to change if you don't burn your bridges. I don't know about you personally, but I find it very hard to change myself. So if I burnt everything down, you've got no choice. And I think that that's effectively what he did, by becoming a drug user, by becoming an openly gay person at that time. He made it very hard to get back into the society that he'd come out of. So from that point of view, there was no turning back. And I think he was also very genuinely curious about what life is like lived outside the scripts that most of us expect to fulfill. And because he had no interest in just doing what's expected of you, it encouraged him to do the unexpected. And one of those was to pursue, I think, the kind of visionary experience that he knew some of the most interesting artists have pursued. I used to teach a course at university called High Culture, which was about kind of the relationship between drug taking and literature. And sometimes students would say, why this kind of narrow field, really? Why are you doing this? And I would say, you're crazy. Give me a list of writers who haven't taken drugs and see how many people are on it. And one reason for that is writers are generally interested in thinking outside the box, in taking their own experiences further than the norms of lived experience. And drug taking is very useful for that because it tends to take you into the company of people you might not have otherwise known. And in Burroughs' case, he was hanging out with small-time hoodlums in New York in the 1940s. It takes you into areas of literature which are often really interesting but quite challenging. And in Burroughs' case, he was trekking through the Amazon for 7 months, taking drugs that very few non-local indigenous people had taken. That's quite risky behavior. But you don't take those kind of risks unless you are being pushed as well as pulled. So there's an element of desperation here. He was unhappy. He had done terrible things. He killed his wife. He was unsuccessful in his gay relationships. He didn't know where his life was going to take him. So he put everything on, 24 black, on the roulette wheel. He was gambling. and he'd heard about these drugs, but very little was known about them. And he's not the kind of person to take other people's word for it. So whereas most of us might be quite satisfied to read other people's accounts of experiences, he wanted the experiences. So he took yage, ayahuasca, several times, and it transformed his view of the world. He realized, as you do on psychedelics, that what you take to be a very stable, solid reality is only stable and solid if you are a bit like a horse with blinkers. If you exclude lots of things, then yes, these things are very real. I've got a job, I've got a life to live, and so have you, and the rest of it. Those things are real, but they're a fraction of what our experience could be. For most of us, that's quite enough. However, I think Burroughs was very aware that we're given a lot of encouragement to keep within those limits. Financial encouragements, social encouragements. For many years, psychedelics were mocked as being just for crazy people. There's more interest in them now than there was back in the 1940s and 50s. That's true. That they're quite kind of cool in some ways now. All Silicon Valley people are doing it. Elon Musk taking ketamine or whatever. Let's not go there, shall we? Anyway, so Burroughs was interested in pushing limits, but actually, after his initial experiences with, I think he did psilocybin mushrooms and LSD, but after those initial experiences, I think he became rather suspicious of the drugs. And I think he became suspicious because he felt that they could be manipulated. Quite early on, I think he realized that capitalism's great strength is it can turn anything into a profit. And Burroughs, I think, was well aware that the life we live is basically there for other people to make money out of us. So he became much more interested in non-chemical ways of changing his reality. And for him, that was writing above all else. So he did experiment in photomontage, in using tapes, in films, painting, and so on. So he experimented along a broad front of activity. But always, I think, he just wanted to find out what else there is in reality than what meets the eye. So I think he had a very skeptical view of reality. And I think he was aware that the view of reality we have now is actually relatively recent. And if you go to other parts of the world where indigenous societies have survived, they don't have the same view of reality as most Westerners have. And so he began to piece together from an anthropological point of view, and he was trained in anthropology, just how much Western society narrows down the world. Our sense of time, our sense of space, our sense of life is actually a very small recent development, which excludes a lot of mystical visionary experience, which most of us don't have, because going from here to the supermarket and going from here to the school and so on, I don't have those kind of experiences. To have them, I would have to be doing magic mushrooms, though that actually doesn't fit in very well with the rest of my life because I haven't got the day for it. So a lot is excluded from our lives. And unless you have intense religious experiences, which are more tolerated, it's very difficult to have them. So I think Burroughs was just very committed to trying to have experiences which mostly we're encouraged not to have. Even the drugs we're encouraged to have, that they're not the most visionary ones. If this was gin, I assure you it's not. But if it was, that would be fine, because you can go in the supermarket and get 100 bottles of different kinds of gin. And in his day, alcohol, as it has been for a long time in the West, is the preferred drug. But the demonization of psychedelics was because they're too close to more visionary experience. So I think there's a lot. I mean, he's a shamanic figure in some ways, as well as being interested in shamans, and he was interested in people like Carlos Castaneda, who again went to Mexico and took peyote and other drugs. I think he was interested in how other cultures have experienced reality, and that then feeds into his writing. So that's a long answer to the question of why he's interested in psychedelics, I think.
I mean, it's a big question. I mean, in the context of the story of Queer, with with the character of William Lee, who you've sort of mentioned isn't Burroughs, how does that feed into his character? And like, because you've said it's about desire, and to me, when I watched the film, it very much felt like he's trying to understand one specific person and what one specific person is thinking. And the interpretation I kind of got out of it is he also sort of is uncomfortable with learning about himself. And like they kind of get to this weird sense of harmony around this campfire, literally. And so how do you think that, in terms of the character of William Lee, I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here.
Yeah, you've got a good question here. You've got a very good question. Because in some ways, although, I mean, Daniel Craig is actually older than Burroughs was at the time and older than William Lee is meant to be. But William Lee actually is described in the novel as having the body of an adolescent. And I think his attitude to desire is very adolescent. It's like, well, I really fancy you, so, can't we have sex? And it's like, well, again, all right, if you insist. And of course, what that tells you is that he has a very immature understanding because, most of us have been in relationships where, we've wanted to have sex with someone who actually they're just not that keen or, can't we wait till tomorrow, and it's like his attitude is to be crushed by this. He just doesn't get it, that actually people don't conform to your desires. And even people who you love and respect and are great, they're not going to do what you want because that's not how individuals are. We want our autonomy. And there's an important exchange in the novel or novella and in the film where Lee says to his boyfriend Allerton, come with me to South America. I'm an easy person to please. What have you got to lose? And Allerton says, well, my independence. And I think that's the point, that Lee wants his own independence and has no understanding that other people actually want theirs too. That's why he fantasizes that this drug, yage, might actually help him control Allerton. And he makes this joke about thought control. In the novella, it's more serious. And you can see that Lee actually is contemplating getting a drug to make his boyfriend do what he wants him to do. Well, if you could control the other person, you're not respecting them as a person. So you see how kind of basic this is. He just doesn't get what it's like to have a relationship. Whether that's a valid insight into William Burroughs, I don't know. I'm not a biographer. I suspect it is. I suspect he was trying to learn about himself by projecting this side of himself. It's a way of getting a part of yourself outside yourself and looking at yourself and then offering that self to the other person. And I think the most shocking aspect of Queer was that he really wrote it for and to his boyfriend. He wanted his boyfriend to read it. And if this is a love letter, it's a really weird kind of love letter. But it is a way of, it's almost a way of saying, look at me at my worst because it's not reflecting well on me and still love me.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know about you, but I've been in a relationship where I wanted to tell the person I love the worst about myself, thinking there's nothing they will ever find out about me that's worse than that. And if they still love me, it's going to be all right. I'm not sure it was all right in this particular case, but that's a different story. But nevertheless, I felt I didn't want any dark secrets about myself. I wanted to say, this is the worst thing I've ever done in my life. Yeah. And you still love me. And I think in a funny way, I think this is a bit like what Burroughs was doing here. It's like, the most excruciating. I mean, he describes at one point his attempt to make casual conversation was painful to watch.
Yeah.
And this is what he sends to his boyfriend. I know is what he's saying. I know that what I've done is like excruciating in some ways, but I still love you.
Yeah.
I still want you. And it's quite pathetic in some ways from a grown man. You'd think that by the time he's in his mid-30s, he would understand that this is not actually going to work. So, but he's trying to work through his emotions and work through, I think, as I say, where it takes him. And I do think that it's important in the novella, especially, this behavior becomes more and more, and the stories he tells become more and more extreme. Yeah. And he begins telling these things that are kind of funny to begin with, and then they're not funny. The film doesn't have quite so much of that, but there's still some darkness in this film about William Lee's character, which tries to, I think, get at a kind of not the unvarnished truth about the original, but nevertheless to understand that if you're going to have sympathy for this person, it's important to have sympathy for who they really are, not how they trying to pretend to be. You know, this is not a kind of a positive portrayal. So the way I would see the relationship between the film's character and the novella's character is a bit like the opening song of the film, which I love. It's a song that most people might recognize if they hear it. You know, it's Nirvana, All Apologies, which was the last song released before Kurt Cobain killed himself. But instead of having Kurt Cobain singing it, it's Sinead O'Connor, and her version is haunting. It's true to the original, but it's softer and more beautiful. And I would say that this is Guadagnino's version of Burroughs. It's true to the original, but it's a softer, more beautiful, more haunting version of the original. And that's therefore quite a clever cover to begin your own film with, because his film is like a cover of Burroughs. And so it doesn't disrespect Kurt Cobain. If you listen to Sinead O'Connor singing it really respects him. It's a true homage.
Yeah.
But her voice is less harsh than Cobain's version of that original is. So that's why I think the film succeeds, even though I think it'll divide opinion. I mean, I think but again, that's okay. Every Burroughs text is polarizing. He's not an easy read. He's not an easy writer to like. So had Guadagnino's film been totally satisfying, I would have been dissatisfied. I'm actually quite glad there are things in it I don't like, because it allows me to think, well, there's things in Burroughs I don't like as well, But it gets all the big calls right. It's funny, it's moving, it's weird. And those are perhaps the main features of William Burroughs that, I'm glad that it has.
Yeah, wow, that was really well put. Going back to sort of your collaboration with them, like you talked to me earlier about, you said you had meetings with Luca and Justin Kuritzkes and Daniel Craig. I'm just interested to know what other kind of questions they asked you, and was there anything that surprised you that came out of that?
Well, the first thing was just how committed they were to the project. I was very relieved about that, that they were prepared to ask my opinion, and they sent me a screenplay, and I wrote back comments almost as long as the screenplay. They got what they asked for. I mean, Daniel Craig was obviously interested in how to play the part, and therefore he was very interested in, I think, Burroughs as a sensual, sexy person, and that was actually a question to me which took me by surprise, because that's not how I'd seen William Burroughs. And so he was making me see the part better. Now, bearing in mind, I can actually recite the text of Queer to you. Lee turned his attention to a Jewish boy named Carl Steinberg. He had known casually for about a year. The first time, I know the text off by heart. And yet, when I was having this discussion with Daniel Craig about how to interpret him sexually, I thought, God, I've never really thought about this. So this was my own blind spot. Maybe it's not being a gay man, but I hadn't really thought about it. And in the text, as you know, there's a lot of there's very little detail. You're kind of left to imagine. And this is what Daniel Craig was wanting to know, how to kind of fill in the blanks. And I think he did it really well. So he was asking about that. Some of the kind of questions were to do with just how William Burroughs was at that era. But as I kept saying, I'm not a biographer. I'm happier talking about the text, because I'm making judgment calls on a piece of writing, which we can all do. When it comes to the man, I only have the biographer's word for it, and I don't know the man. I met him a couple of times, but I don't know the man. And so I'm much more cautious about judging the man. I'm much happier talking about William Lee. So I tried to make my own kind of distinction. But I think I was also trying to get at one of the problems with Burroughs, which is that, a bit like me, he's a man in a hat, but he had a gun and he had a syringe and all the rest of it, and was a famous writer, unlike me. So he had a lot of kind of iconic properties, and I've always felt they got in the way. That if you know much about Burroughs or come across him, he tends to sound so cool and so kind of weird that you then view his writing through that lens. And that tends to then mean you just don't see certain things that don't fit that image. and other things that fulfill the image is what you focus on. That's very limiting. And again, one reason why I'd much prefer this adaptation of Queer to adaptation of Naked Lunch was that Peter Weller did a quite good imitation of Burroughs, but it was the imitation of Burroughs as a kind of cool, drawling, kind of slow talking, dry, humored man. And that's the kind of image that is quite depthless. I think what Daniel Craig did so well was he gave real depth to the performance. And whether it was absolutely how William Burroughs was, I don't know, probably not. Is it a good interpretation of William Lee? Absolutely. So again, I'm happy with that distinction. And from that point of view, I think he gave his character real emotion. And yeah, I was speaking to some people afterwards, after watching the film last night at this wonderful event with Luca and Daniel and Justin. And some people came up to me and they said how moving they found the film. And you know, that I'm really glad that's a kind of first response, because if you're not moved by the film, then why are you interested enough to even talk about it? And I feel the same about Burroughs. If you don't find Burroughs moving or funny or dangerous, then who cares about what they did on page 93? You know,
Yeah.
do something else in life. But if you find these people get a reaction out of you, even a negative reaction to begin with, then it's worth your while living with this and finding out more and taking it further. So, I watched the film again last night on the big screen. This was at the Regent Street Cinema in London. And it's a really impressive experience. I mean, well, where did you see it, by the way?
I saw it at the London Film Festival. So I was very lucky.
And the Royal Festival Hall.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, that's an enormous venue, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw it there as well for the first time. Yeah. I mean, it's a great venue to see it because it's so big on the screen, and obviously, if you're watching it on your phone, it's not going to be quite as impressive. And it's a beautiful film as well. So, yeah, no, it left me quite feeling quite emotional too, which again is what I want. Because as an academic, all my training is to start, thinking of clever things to say. Well, yeah, okay. They can have their place, but I'm much more interested in having an engagement with the film on another level first.
Yeah.
It touches you enough to then want to know more, find out more, think more. But if you don't feel it to begin with, then your thinking is going to be a bit kind of, well, yeah, I can think about something else.
Yeah. So you mentioned as well that you met Burroughs a couple times. I'm kind of interested to know about that. Like, what was that like, and what was he like as a person standing in front of you?
Well, I went to see him when I was 23, so I was, green as the day is long. I then just started really reading him. I'd had a girlfriend at the time who had very good taste in literature, and she gave me some Burroughs to read. And I'd spoken to my professors at the time, and I said, I quite fancy doing a PhD on Burroughs. There's nobody else seems to have done anything. And they said, yeah, there's a good reason why nobody else has done anything on him. Don't do Burroughs, you'll never get a job. And so I thought, I don't want a job anyway. So I decided to study Burroughs also because he was alive. Never you go and meet him. So it gave me an opportunity to do a trip to the US, which I'd never been to before. So I did a 3-month kind of research trip to the US where I was hanging out with Allen Ginsberg in New York and lots of interesting people on the West Coast. And in the middle, there was William Burroughs in Lawrence, Kansas. I think the thing that most impressed me was how much time he gave me and how generous and gracious he was with his time. And if I've learned anything from him, it was that. I tend to try and give people as much time as I can afford to give, because that's one of the few gifts we really have to give each other. And that impressed me because I was known from nowhere. Why should he, allow me to sort of hang around and have chats with him and go shopping to the supermarket and buy cat food? He took me out shooting to Lone Star Lake. I can still remember him with these guns, and he holds one up and I said, is it loaded? And he turns to me and says, oh, my guns are loaded. And I'm thinking, okay, well, you're obviously very comfortable with guns and I'm obviously not. So he made me feel like a very prissy Englishman, which was fine. He had a dry sense of humor. He would tell stories to see my reaction, and it was interesting. And if he didn't want to answer a question, he would just pick up one of his cats and start talking to it. But he was very gentlemanly. He had perfect manners, even the way he would sort of pick up a joint. He had such beautiful control of his fingers and was very kind of controlled. And he was just very, very polite and straightforward. But in retrospect, I also realized he told me absolutely nothing he didn't want me to know. And occasionally I'd ask questions and he would give me answers which he'd given to previous people. And afterwards I was thinking, that's probably not true, is it? And then I'd find out it wasn't true. So he was quite professional, I think, in that way, but totally open, sort of, he had no edge to him, and he had no, I don't want to put anybody down, but when I met Allen Ginsberg, it was always a bit obvious that he was kind of thinking, you could see his kind of mind working about how he was going to play you. And I didn't feel that with Burroughs. I think he just was very straightforward, and this is how he is, and that's what he was. So yeah, he gave me his time. I found him very respectful. He reminded me very much of my father, who at that time had been ill for many years and died shortly afterwards, and therefore was somebody I didn't really sort of know terribly well as a young man. And he reminded me of him, and maybe there's a bit of projection on that, but it meant that I kind of engaged with him as a 70-year-old man and felt quite warm towards him. And it became obvious that he had been, I suppose the image of Burroughs was so cool and so dangerous. His books are so out there that to meet somebody who you felt like giving a hug to was not the obvious reaction. So I was taken by surprise by him. I had some good interviews with him as well, but I think it was always going to be on the level of a personal encounter. So I felt warm towards him. I felt a certain bond, but at the same time, I also knew we were worlds apart. I mean, even just being in Kansas, nothing in my experience prepared. Have you ever been to Kansas?
No.
Strange place, very, very flat. So the sky is very big. This was a university town, Lawrence. So this is the cultural capital in a way of the state, but still quite a difficult environment for somebody who's not familiar with American society. And I went back there a few times afterwards, and I met him a couple of times in England as well, but very superficial. I wouldn't ever claim to have known him. And I think that's, again, been quite useful for me to keep my place. I'm not a biographer, and I know that he's not somebody I could really understand. But it gave me enough of a connection to feel very grateful when I was given the extraordinary privileged opportunity to work on his texts. Lots of academics get the chance to write clever things about authors, but I got the chance to write clever things about the author, having actually worked on the manuscripts to produce editions. Now that's a different order of privilege, and also much more responsibility, because if you're just being clever, then nice if you are, and not big deal if you're not. But when you're trying to edit a text from manuscripts and trying to make additions and changes and understand things, being clever is not the point. It's much more important to be justified, to do things. I mean, I wouldn't use terms right and wrong because it doesn't really work that way. But I think, I want people to trust that I've made good decisions in the way I've done things. That is a responsibility in a way that, like I say, being clever is not. That clever is nice, but it's not responsibility. So I've been very lucky to have done that on, over a dozen editions. And, last week I literally published my 23rd or 24th book, which is partly about Burroughs, partly about other things as well. But so I spent, a productive 40 years, working with and on stuff by Burroughs. And I think I've learned some good life lessons, and I've also been very lucky. So, it's been good for me.
I'd like to thank Professor Oliver Harris for giving me his time as my guest in this video. As mentioned in my introduction, I came away from this interview feeling enriched about my understanding of the movie. If you've listened to this conversation and engaged with the film, in whatever order that happens to you, I certainly hope you feel the same way. I really enjoy having conversations like this, and I'm thinking I should try and do some more. It's educational but also gratifying. If you'd like to see that also and have any suggestions of who I can chat to, leave a comment to let me know. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching this video. I'll see you next time.